Hi, I'm Shruti Rajagopalan, and today I'm going to talk to you about the incentives of political actors in developing countries, especially India. Once you've mastered applying the economic way of thinking to politics, it is useful to think about the kinds of policy problems faced by developing countries. Only 15% of the global population lives in the developed world. Thinking about incentives of political actors governing the remaining 6.5 billion people living under various institutional arrangements is an important area of inquiry. There are two ways of thinking about developing countries. The first is through the lens of development economics, and the second through development policy. Development economists ask, why are some countries rich while other countries are poor? And development policy makers try to understand how can we move from poverty to prosperity. Most of us in the developed world enjoy cutting-edge technology with good software, computers, and internet access to do our schoolwork. But reading under the streetlight is not an unusual activity for people living in poor countries. This disparity is really puzzling. After all, Edison received his patent for the light bulb 141 years ago in 1880. Soon after, by 1882, New Yorkers were able to light their bulbs using the electricity supplied by the Pearl Street station. The distance from Edison's electricity generation company in Pearl Street to the homes of those young schoolboys under the streetlight in Guinea is only about 4,300 miles. But even 140 years is not enough to reach the light bulb connected to reliable electricity in Guinea. So why the delay? Is it a technological problem? No, it's an incentive problem. Let's take a closer look. Electricity in Guinea is provided by a single government-owned and run electricity utility company. As the picture of boys studying under street lamps suggests, electricity distribution through the utility company suffers from weak governance, old infrastructure, poor maintenance of assets, frequent blackouts, high electricity theft rates and losses, poor billing and collection rates, the list goes on. And all this because it does not care about actually making profits. But the government employees can't be fired, regardless of how poorly they do their jobs. And the low subsidized price of electricity for the lucky consumers who have access is determined by political considerations. The first lesson of development policy is also the first lesson of economics. Incentives matter. And public choice theory treats government employees the same as any other individuals. They too respond to incentives. The right incentives can shrink the time taken for technology to traverse these 4,300 miles. And with the wrong incentives, even 140 years is not enough. Let's look at another example of lights, this time from space, and turn from the importance of incentives to the importance of institutions. This is a picture of North and South Korea taken from space. North Korea is almost completely dark compared to South Korea. The darkened land appears as if it were a patch of water joining the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan. South Koreans are at least 20 times richer, about 3 inches taller on average, and enjoy every comfort known to the developed world. North Koreans, on the other hand, are poor, malnourished, and are dealing with famines and drought, lack of electricity, sanitation, and the list goes on and on. Even an alien watching these two countries from space can see the difference. It is unbelievable, but this was a single country sharing a common history, culture, and people less than 75 years ago. The only difference is the institutions governing the two countries. One is a communist dictatorship, and the other, after a long struggle, is a democratic republic that embraced free trade. So with this single photograph, we can see the drastic impact that these different institutions had and see that institutions really do matter. It is also important to keep context in mind when we discuss these examples. Decisions can't be applied the same across all countries because every country is different. When we think about poverty versus prosperity, we typically assume that those with higher incomes are better educated, have advanced degrees, some highly specialized knowledge, and that explains the variation. Say, between the income of a doctor versus a gardener. But what is interesting is that even though doctors across the world need to go to medical school, train in highly specialized areas, and have similar levels of knowledge, they have very different incomes. The same worker would make 4 times the income doing the same work in the United States as opposed to Bolivia. For Nigerians, the difference is even higher, at 8 times the income. In a paper called The Place Premium by Michael Clemens, Claudio Montenegro, and Lant Pritchett, they argue that our wages are not determined by what we know, but where we live. It is not about poor people, it is about poor regions. They argue that removing immigration restrictions on labor and simply allowing labor mobility can reduce a given household's poverty to a much greater degree than most known anti-poverty interventions in these developing countries. However, voting is within national boundaries and usually only a right for citizens within the national boundary. In most developed countries, citizens and special interests support immigration restrictions. The immigrants who would benefit from mobility have no say in the matter because they do not get to vote on policies for countries where they would like to live. And not all poor regions are the same. In the opening words of Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy wrote, "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." It is similar for the developing world. While some regions may seem similar in their poverty, all regions are not poor because of the same reasons. Context matters. To recap, what is the nature of development problems? First, it is not a technological problem but an incentive problem. Second, institutions matter. Third, it is not about poor people, it is about poor regions. And lastly, not all poor regions are poor for the same reasons. Context matters. And here are some main lessons from public choice. First, political actors are self-interested. Second, incentives matter in all spheres of development, social, cultural, economic, and political. And finally, that we need to design policies that align self-interest with social interest. Take the example of one particularly large group trapped in poverty, Indian farmers. About 150 million Indians are directly engaged in farming, and about 600 million Indians rely on allied agricultural activities for their income. Indian farmers are vulnerable to the stresses of weather disruptions, global markets, small land holding sizes, and low productivity. In years of drought, in India, farmer suicides increase. Wouldn't it be amazing if Indian farmers had magic beans like Jack to dramatically increase their productivity? Incidentally, such a technology does exist. No magic, just human innovation through genetically modified seeds. But the Indian government has banned the use of genetically modified seeds in most categories, even though they increase yields and farmers want to use them. The reason is that some special interest groups have a big interest in blocking genetically modified seeds. But can't ordinary people and politicians see through these special interests? To explain why and how GMOs are banned in India, let's take a short detour to some southern states in the United States where the law prohibits the sale and purchase of alcohol on Sundays. However, alcohol consumption on Sundays is not prohibited. In his 1983 paper, Bruce Yandel argued that this peculiar regulation is backed by 2 groups. One is the clergy, or the Baptists, who have moral reasons for supporting alcohol prohibition on Sundays. But the other group benefiting from the prohibition is bootleggers, who can stock up and illegally sell alcohol at a profit on Sundays. Now, the bootleggers and Baptists are strange bedfellows. We don't normally put them together. But this odd coalition of moral interests of the Baptists and economic interests of the bootleggers makes alcohol prohibition not only more likely and more persistent, but also more difficult to detect as serving a special interest. Coming back to the plight of the Indian farmer and genetically modified seeds, they also have their own version of bootleggers and Baptists. Some people believe that GMOs are bad for their health, even poisonous, and that they damage the environment and reduce plant diversity. This is despite overwhelming scientific evidence that proves that GMOs are safe to eat and that they bring environmental benefits by making agriculture more sustainable. But environmentalists, Parents, journalists, usually motivated by public interest, believe that there is something wrong with GMOs. They're a small minority in India and in most other places. Like the Baptists in Bruce Yandel's theory of regulation, they are well-intentioned, vocal, and don't personally profit from the ban. But this story also has bootleggers. Farmers using genetically modified seeds reduce their dependency on insecticides and pesticides and even some kind of chemical fertilizers. So insecticide and pesticide manufacturers, like the bootleggers in the American South, stand to profit from a ban on GMOs. Another problem plaguing Indian farmers is low prices for their produce. All else equal, a larger market for any farmer means that more consumers can compete for the produce, enabling better prices. However, some states in India prevent this by requiring farmers to sell their produce only at the markets run by the Agricultural Produce Market Committee, or as it is known, the APMC. The APMC in some Indian states divides the market geographically into different regions and insists that a farmer can only sell to the market in her region. Traders running these markets need a license, and those who hold the license directly benefit because they effectively have a monopoly over where the farmer sells their produce. These licenses are acquired by those with political patronage, often used as a side business for politicians or their family members. The farmer receives depressed prices while the final consumer pays a high price for the same produce. All the money goes to the politically blessed and licensed middleman. All this is well known, and many policymakers have tried to remove these licensed markets and bring in economic reforms in agriculture. Even though almost everyone is in agreement that moving from controlled agricultural markets to liberalized agricultural markets would benefit farmers and consumers, it is difficult to change the rules in many states. This is because the special interests holding the licenses are too strong. The reason is because the market license granted a monopoly and allowed license holders to make monopoly profits, some of the middlemen paid vast sums of money to acquire this license. This is also known as the capitalization of rents because the future stream of income expected from operating the markets with the license has increased. But the elimination of the privileges at this point would be harmful to all the existing license holders, causing them substantial capital losses on the value of their market license. So they block the reforms. Gordon Tullock calls this a transitional gains trap. These traps exist everywhere, even in the developed world. Like the New York City yellow taxi cab cartel lobbying the government to cap the number of Ubers in New York City. Another big problem in India and many parts of South Asia and Africa is open defecation. This is people defecating in the open, causing a massive problem of public sanitation. Typically, this practice is associated with low-income groups in rural areas who cannot afford to access toilets. At higher income levels, people are more likely to have access to toilets. So it seems like all India needs is more toilets. This led Prime Minister Modi to distribute free toilets to the poor in India. But in India, the problem is more complex. Unlike other countries, toilet use is not just linked to income, but also caste. Ideas about ritual impurity associated with dealing with human feces prevent caste Hindus from having toilets inside their homes that are not well connected to sewage systems. The reason is that if toilets cannot be flushed away but need to be cleaned with manual pumps or hands, they would be considered impure. So caste Indians would rather defecate in the open than use free toilets that are not connected to the sewage system or where the waste cannot be simply flushed away. So it is not just toilets, but also the disposal of the waste that is critical. Indians don't need free toilets as much as they need sewage and waste disposal systems. And once again, the problem is not technological. The Indus Valley civilization is the earliest example of drainage and sewage systems in the world. Indians literally invented this technology. The problem once again is political incentives. First, building sewage systems takes years of digging and disruption of life, especially in congested urban areas. All the costs are borne in the present, while the benefits through better sanitation will be reaped in the future, often by children yet to be born. The second problem is dispersed benefits and concentrated costs. You've heard of special interests lobbying for corn or sugar subsidies in the United States because the benefits are concentrated for a small group of producers while the costs are dispersed across a large number of consumers. This makes it easy for sugar or corn farmers to organize and act collectively as a special interest group. But with sewage systems, the inability to have collective action is due to dispersed benefits and concentrated costs. All the benefits are distributed across all citizens over time. But the costs of the digging and disruption are borne by the politician who initiated the project. The disruption may lead to loss of popularity, even elections. Even in London in the 19th century, it was not easy for elected officials to act swiftly to improve water treatment, sewage, and draining systems, despite the cholera epidemics and River Thames turning into a giant sewer. This kind of policy paralysis is even seen in developed countries. All these problems of collective action show that the issue is not one of technology or even resources, but of incentives and institutions. Often, economists try to solve the problems of special interests or collective action or transitional gains traps by assuming the problem away. Many economics models begin with assuming a benevolent dictator. We have only one visual for this idea of a benevolent dictator: Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. He's considered the savior of Singapore. But assuming benevolence from dictators is not working out too well for the 49 countries in the world currently under dictatorial regimes. Once again, the problem is incentives. What are the incentives of a dictator? To stay in power. So dictators, like others, are also self-interested and pursue their goal of staying in power. If we solve the problem by allowing dictators to stay in power for a long time, then maybe sewage systems would be built. Let's take a trip to Uganda, where Yoweri Museveni is now in his 6th term and has been in power since 1986. But in Kampala, the nation's capital, the urban sewage system covers less than 10% of the city's population. Remember, his incentive is to stay in power, and clearly building better sanitation systems does not help him with that goal. These are some of the ways by which we can understand and perhaps solve development problems across different regions in the world using public choice theory. Concepts like the Bootleggers and Baptist theory of regulation, concentrated benefits and dispersed costs leading to special interests, transitional gains traps preventing reforms, or dispersed benefits and concentrated costs leading to policy paralysis, all help explain some of the big problems in the developing world, like open defecation, low agricultural productivity, lack of electricity, immigration restrictions, and so on. Most importantly, policy solutions can never be transplanted. And to be a good development economist and policymaker, insights from public choice theory are critical. So to conclude, here are some lessons from public choice theory that can be applied to development problems. First, that political actors, just like everyone else, are self-interested. Second, incentives matter in all spheres of development: social, cultural, economic, and political. Third, we need to design policies that align self-interest of the political actors with social interests. And finally, we must take into account local context and culture instead of exporting solutions from the developed world to developing countries.